Hi everybody. This is the first of a three-part series which I originally did for the APL. I've split it up into three bite-sized pieces. The original name of the webinar was called Your Costs, the Project's Costs, and Managing Client Expectations. So this first part is called the Project's Costs. It's going to take about 20 minutes, so get a cup of tea, sit back, relax, and enjoy. Here's quite a clever little graphic that was shown to me by a structural engineer friend of mine when I had a discussion with him about how he handles his budgets. And what he came up with was this. So here's the whole project duration. There's the beginning of the project. There's the end of the project. And on your first client meeting, when the client has some idea of what they want to spend, or none, as the case may be, and neither do you, your variation in what you know about the budget can vary from very high to very low. But at the final account, which might be 3 months later or 2 years later, you know exactly what the amount that the client has spent is. So the point being that as you proceed through the project, you start from very high variation in knowledge to exact knowledge, and the only point that you really know what the spend is on that final day when the contractor presents his final account. Now, there's a number of steps which you go through in the meantime, and those are your first client meeting. You do a initial concept plan and have a discussion. Look, you're getting closer to the truth now, and this line is starting to get closer and closer to there. You then do a detailed design, and you've got a cost plan. You might have an outline schedule of quantities, which we're coming to later in this little webinar, and you might even cost that on garden costs or a similar program or using information which you already have. By the time you go out to tender, your lines are narrowing over here and you're getting even closer. Now, they might get closer one way or another. You might be below or above, but you're getting closer and closer to your truth, which is that point over there. VE is value engineering options. That means making it cheaper by substituting different ideas into it. Variations which pop up during the contract could also make it more or less. Provisional sums which kick in during the course of the contract, which you allowed for, lighting or the water feature, or claims that arise, like you had extra topsoil or delays, etc. And finally, you're at the day where the final bill is presented by the contractor, and only at that point do you know what your final account is going to be. This is a typical scenario for all of you, and I wonder how many of you will smile inwardly when you hear the scenario. A client calls you up and says, I want to design a garden. You say, okay, I'm going to come and see you. And you meet them at their home and they say to you, I want this, that, and the other. I saw your work down at Maria's house, and I want a nice garden. And you look at the garden and it's got nothing much in it. And you immediately come up with some ideas for your garden. And you discuss these with your client. Your client says they want a new patio, they do a lot of entertainment, they want a pool, an ornamental pool, they want a fire pit, they want those pleachers like Maria's got because they're really lovely, and you want a vegetable garden, and all the other elements of a garden that people see in magazines, etc. So here's the scenario. The client calls the designer requests a budget. the client doesn't know or declines to give a budget. They're often suspicious and don't give you the budget. So you go ahead without demanding the budget and you design it. The client loves your designs, says that's exactly what I want. How wonderful you are. You go out to tender to your favorite contractors and boom, the tenders come back. Big shock. They're too expensive. Or you have no idea if they're too expensive or not, but you take them to the client and the client says, oh, I didn't want to spend that much. I only wanted to spend 55,000 with that. And your tenders have come in at 100,000. The job gets shelved and you are fired and you walk off without having achieved your project. In scenario number 2, however, which is similar to the beginning, at the beginning, the client calls the designer, you pop along and you have a lovely meeting, you request a budget. The client doesn't know what the budget is or provides the budget. If they don't know what the budget is, you help them work out what their budget is. And this is coming up in the latter part or the next part of this presentation. So you now have a budget and you design a lovely garden. The client loves your garden and you manage to put a budget to the elements of your design. And you've been doing this all along, right through your design process, so that you make sure you are matching your budget. The client amends various things throughout your design. You're in constant contact with them and you go out to tender and the tender comes back to budget because you've been working on that. You have some idea. You don't have to be too specific about it, but you know what the various elements cost. Your job gets built and the designer gets paid and gets references. So just starting from a rough sketch on site, which you did in your notebook, you are then able to work this up into a budget, into a design, and work to a client budget and a client design, which enables your job to get built.
I don't think you've been scrolling through. I think you've just been chatting.
I told you there were going to be.
They're all now saying, now I can.
Yeah. All right. I'll summarize quickly where we were. It will take me a second to get back to where we were. So let's get back to where we started.
I think you do need to speak to Charlotte.
To Charlotte. I'll speak to Charlotte. Is Charlotte in today?
No, she's not on this one.
She's not in this one. Okay. Right. So we talked about the initial meeting and the budget. You heard what I said, but this was just the poster about that. And yes, it's completely my fault. I know exactly what I didn't do. We then went to the next slide, which was just a view of a house, and scenario number 1, which I talked about, where the client declines to give a budget or the designer is not forceful enough in getting that budget out. The next one is scenario number 2, which the designer gets a budget and designs to the client's budget based on a little sketch which they produced at the first meeting on site in your little Hemingway notebooks, which you carry around. You threw some ideas at the client and they came up and said, yes, we like that, we don't like that. And you went and you developed that and you got to a point of a first initial presentation, and then you got to a budget thereafter. Now, let's take a look, step backwards or sideways, and I'm going to show you a job which I worked on and how we actually do it. So what started was a concept, which I'm bringing onto screen now, of a vegetable garden. Now, this was a job I did with a landscape designer for a vegetable garden, which is this little design over here. And just to see it in slightly more detail, there it is in as it was going to be designed as the vegetable garden, as part of a bigger scenario. Here are the photographs of what the site looked like at the time, which was basically pretty blank. And here is what the site looked like at the end once the vegetable garden had been built. This is early stages of planting the vegetable garden, but here's your fully built vegetable garden. So what are the steps in between that? Let's have a look. We go back to the slide over here. Within our first meeting, we try to get the client to establish a budget. And just by putting down some rough figures based on the drawing that we've just done, the very rough sketch which we've just done, and I'm bringing this up live over here. We say, all right, well, let me help you to establish a budget. Let's see what we can do. I think in my best possible way that we're going to spend $5,000 on demolitions. We'll spend $6,000 on your patio. The retaining wall we'll need a little retaining wall. That'll cost $4,000. We need some steps. You wanted a pergola? We can do a pergola at £9,000. Let's put it in there. And you want a fire pit. You want those nice pleachers like Maria's got down the road. You saw those trees in boxes. Yes, they're called pleachers. We'll get some of those in for you. Some nice big other trees. Let's put those in at couple of grand over here. More planting, etc., etc. And we get to a figure of 56,000. Now, we do say that the contractor will need preliminaries. Sorry, what are preliminaries? Oh, preliminaries are all the costs that the contractor needs to get their machinery to site, to protect your site, their health and safety. Oh, okay, I guess those have to go in somewhere. Then the contractor needs to make a profit on their job. I anticipate, with my knowledge as a designer, that they'll probably work on a 20 to 25% profit. That's $12,500. And because I'm not sure about anything at the moment, I'm going to allow a 20% contingency for this job. So we're coming out at a basis of £88,000, and with that, it's going to be 106. How does that sound? And the client's visibly shocked, and they said, oh, I didn't realize that these were going to cost so much. So you've now got to a point where the client's talking to you and saying, oh, okay, I've got some idea of costs. I really we don't want to spend that much, maybe a little bit less. How can we do it a little bit less? Well, we could change that pergola to a softwood pergola, and we could take our patio, and instead of stone, we could do some really nice concrete pavings, which would cost £4,000. We can leave out the water feature for now. We can design it in. I'll design that in for you, and in a few years' time, we can put that in, but I'll make provision for it, and I'm afraid you're going to have to lose the fire pit. So yes, those trees, we'll have to make the trees a little bit smaller as well. And you're starting to get now to a point where you might be coming into the client's budgets, and the client will be saying, oh, okay, well, 67. I was thinking of more or less 55 or something like that, all in all, without that. But do you know what? I'll have a chat with my partner, and I'm sure, because it's something we really want to do. Let's see if we can stretch ourselves to 67. And that is the kind of process which you would go through on that. So looking at this particular job, which I was showing you a few minutes ago, the vegetable garden, I'm just opening up the scenario on that. So what we did on that drawing is we took the drawing for this particular job, which I showed you, and it was more detailed in that it was a CAD drawing. And we would have broken that down, and this is the method that you should use if you want to, and the only method if you want to extract cost, is to break things down into as many granular areas as possible. So you measure and you make line items. It's a tedious job. It's not fun, but this is the way you would extract a budget for the job. So getting granularity in the job is the way that the budget would work out. And this is a second or third step, really. And this can be done pretty quickly when you get to a bottom line, which I've taken out here for confidentiality purposes with contingencies, etc. And you're coming to a budget which you can then talk about, discuss, revise, etc. And once you've got that, you are free to get back to your drawing board and start your real design process, which evolves and evolves and evolves, as you know. Nothing happens on your first visit that is fully reflected on your last presentation, because your design evolves. It evolves as you're driving along in your car. It evolves as you're eating dinner. It evolves as you reading your kids their stories. You have an idea that you saw in even one of their picture books that you're feeding into that. So once you've got your budget establishment done, you then have a budget for the job, which you can then go forward with and take into the next part of the design. For the very final part of this little webinar, I'm going to introduce you to a clip by John Wire of Bowles and Wire, who had a very eloquent alternative view on how his firm views client budgets.
We have a slightly different approach on that, actually, which is that we do a lot of research on the property and the client before we go there, so that we have a pretty good idea of whether they're going to be, in the right area in terms of budget or not. And we then show them projects and we tell them how much those projects cost, but we never ask budget at the first meeting because their budgets are likely to be unrealistic. So there's always a gap between what clients actually aspire to and what they're willing to spend. And a lot of the time, I think if you actually deliver a scheme for what they first say they want to spend, they'll be disappointed. But if you delivered a scheme at the other end of the spectrum for what they actually wanted, what they aspire to, they'll think that they've spent too much and they won't be happy. So the trick is to find a balance point along that spectrum, and that process takes a little while. But we don't start off by asking them what their budget is. We make them want what we're showing them first, and then show them what it's cost on other projects, and they then get an idea, and they often adjust their idea of what they might spend during that first part of the process.
Thank you for listening. In the next webinar, I am going to talk about how you calculate and manage your design costs and work out your costs to your client.